Hello, and welcome to the sixth installment of Race and Racism. Today we're going to be summarizing first some strategies and some conceptual analysis that we've covered up until now, and then we'll jump into Audre Lorde, the uses of anger, and he recently published The New Jim Crow. I'm going to draw out some argumentative themes from each of those, although, to be fair, they are incredibly detailed and worth more careful study on their own. So we'll start here with summary. Again, conceptual analysis. These are just some conceptual terms and distinctions that have been useful to us so far. I just want to remind you of them here. I won't go through them because in the last lecture and in class I did. But you can see them here on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side we have strategies. This is old hat. We've already covered this stuff. Today we're going to be talking about some more, largely in this discussion we'll be talking about anger and frustration, and in class we'll pivot into body language as a strategy. So this will be new hat stuff to add. Speaking of which, let's talk about Audre Lorde. So, some background, just conceptually speaking. Let's think about the attitude of blame. This is what we philosophers sometimes call a reactive attitude. And it is what it sounds like. It's a reaction to a situation or some action. Like if you steal my phone, I'm gonna blame you, right? Now, reactive attitudes are considered by many to be rational in some respects, and so far as they're responsive to reasons and justifications, much like beliefs are. So belief is a rational attitude, in part because if you believe something and later figure out you were wrong, you'll change your initial belief. Blame is considered to be rational in a somewhat similar way. So for instance, if you blame someone for spoiling a movie, but then realizing it was some child who didn't know any better, you frequently will suspend your blame. Contrast this with my friend Andy, who spoils movies all the time and knows better. I blame him often, and I tell him that, and you can tell him too. He deserves it. If Andy tries not to spoil a movie, but does so anyway in accident, I'd likely suspend my blame. I mean, he did try not to, right? Mistakes and errors, like legitimate, excusable errors, they usually excuse blame as well. And again, in that respect, blame is supposed to be rational or have like rational constraints on it, much like beliefs do. Just summarize here, roughly speaking, rational reactive attitudes seem to have these properties. If you realize the target of the attitude is a legitimate excuse for what they've done, you typically suspend that attitude. Now, Audre Lorde seems to treat anger like a rational reactive attitude in just this sense, at least insofar as anger can be used strategically to illustrate feelings of injustice. Now, there is a distinction to be made between anger and hate, though. Anger involves feeling of unjust treatment within the context of shared values. Hate, however, that signals that some divide has been sharply drawn and irreparably so. You don't hate your friends, you hate your enemies, but you can be angry with your friends. And of course, you can be angry with your enemies too. But hate is scorched earth. Now, anger is, it seems, an appropriate response to illustrate frustration and injustice among colleagues, for instance. And this seems to be what Lorde is doing in this speech. She's observing, been involved in several discussions with white academic feminists who have been trying, but failing in sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle ways to treat her as a person who deserves respect, to give her the appropriate credibility she deserves. She is putting it to them that anger is not something they should be afraid of, but something they can learn from, and it's justified. It's, however, not often treated this way in polite conversation, as it were. It's often considered irrational or erratic, and when people get angry, that signals that the argument or the discussion's over, right? Like, who can come back from anger? But look, it seems right, though, sometimes. And Audre Lorde is identifying situations in which it's right. In the presence of repeated failures to understand oppressions relevant to non-white experiences, Lorde is saying, look, it's needed. It's appropriate and needed. It's the right attitude to have. For instance, in the presence of repeated failures to understand the intersections of oppression relevant to non-white experiences, instead of listening and creating space for people from other backgrounds to speak and fill that space and fill those experiences, white academic feminists and as Audre's experiences have indicated, they are inquiring, asking questions, which is what they're trained to do, and likely in the interest of being helpful. But nevertheless, that sort of help can shut things down. It can divert attention to what's really important, which is that they are wrong. And as much as they try to be right, as much as they try to do the right thing, there's going to be something they're missing, and they're going to continue to miss it if they don't listen. Anger, Audrey is identifying here as a useful tool, a tool among friends who share the same values, that something is amiss, some injustice is going on, and maybe listening is a better tactic than trying to actively figure out what's going on with limited information. Now, I want to say this on the face of it presents a puzzle, because reactive attitudes are often thought to be suspended once excusable mistakes have been recognized as generated in target action. But here Lord is observing that anger is an appropriate response to academic feminists who are trying their best. They are just in error in making mistakes. They are trained to inquire. I mean, this is what academics do, right? And typically, let's be fair, when people are presented with problems, they use whatever skill set they have to solve them. It seems, though, that these intellectuals do have plausible excuses for why they're having such difficulty understanding where they go wrong. They're like Andy. They're trying and they're failing. But this might suggest that, in contrast to what Lord is saying, that we shouldn't be angry with him, and maybe Lord shouldn't be angry with him either. Now, let's say this is only just a sort of prima facie, or like at face value puzzle, because I think there are two larger points that help Audre Lorde avoid this sort of traditional way of thinking of reactive attitudes, and this sort of additional context I think will help our understanding generally. First, look, it does seem hardly the case to say that members of the audience were just making mistakes, just simply making mistakes. Look, they have plenty of evidence of the wrongdoings of their behaviors. They were not respecting the evidence. And it is true that when you are presented with a puzzle or a problem as an academic, I can speak from experiences, you pull from the toolkit you have, and we often try to solve them, those problems, with the tools that we have at our disposal. At the same time, there is wisdom in sitting back and listening. There is wisdom in respecting repeated failures of your toolkit to solve puzzles. And I think that, on one hand, is a good enough reason to be angry with them, because really they should have known better. In addition, even providing legitimate excuses to the targets of anger, even if we say something like they didn't have enough evidence, which again I don't think is true, I think on moral grounds it's still appropriate to be angry with them. Harms warrant anger, I think, is right because of this, especially as a strategy for identifying those harms, especially if this seems to be the only way, or one of the only ways to do it. Rational discussion is not working. Pointing out where white academic feminists have gone wrong in their discussing of the issues or how they're treating people from other backgrounds has not been helpful. You can lead them to water, but they might not drink, right? You do that repeatedly. What else can you do, right? Anger seems to be something that might be useful in this respect, as a way to shock the system. I'd express anger at my child if that's the only way to get them not to touch a stove. So ultimately, I think there's no puzzle here for Lord. Anger is distinct from hate. It's an appropriate attitude towards morally and epistemically problematic behavior in general. And this is especially true, I think, if other strategies have routinely failed to address that behavior. I'd add, too, that expressing anger in such a context seems a useful way to approach validation among peers. The proceeding has been approached philosophically in a sort of sterile way. It's kind of high level and abstract. But there is an emotional side that's worth appreciating, and one I would like to discuss in class. So I got, get the abstract stuff out of the way here. We can discuss the meatier, more substantial stuff together. But here, we can think about the emotional labor involved in trying to help friends and colleagues identify their own failings. Like what that costs a speaker. Like what that costs somebody like Audre Lorde. Like how hard that is to deal with on a daily basis. And how frustrating it is to see your friends and colleagues fail so often, despite their best efforts, even. Which is just to say, in a way perhaps distinct from the proceeding, Lorde was right to be angry and right to express that anger to her peers. Now, we'll move on to Alexander and the New Jim Crow. And here, I want to give some historical background because I've only signed the last chapter. Recall that after the Civil War, the federal government occupied the Southern Confederate states, and they enforced enfranchisement of black voters, and created, social, like a safer space for previously enslaved individuals to operate. Now, this led to increased political, economic, and social power, and this is known as the Reconstruction era. Not too long ago. Now, during this time, the racist Southern politicians gained power. And this was underwritten by white paramilitary groups. These are groups that are, military focused, operating outside of the law, such as the White League, which is largely composed of Confederate veterans who worked to suppress voting by black individuals. Now, there's a reason that the Reconstruction era has such a sharp cutoff in 1877. This is because this year saw what was one of three events in U.S. politics known as the corrupt bargains. This was the election of 1876 between Rutherford Hayes and Samuel Tilden. It was a very close race. Several southern states had contested voter turnout, and this led to contested electoral college votes, which in turn led to the election being determined by the House of Representatives. Now I'm glossing over some details. Basically, the important part here is that Rutherford struck a deal with members of the House representing southern states. If they voted for him instead of Tilden, he would agree to the removal of federal troops from southern states and allow the southern states to have self-rule. What do you think happened? He won. He removed federal troops. Now, to be fair, black representatives were elected to several local offices in the South. They were nevertheless blocked from higher level offices like House positions and Senate positions due to voter suppression and legislation. Jim Crow laws ultimately disenfranchised members of black communities, and voter turnout within a few years dropped to nearly 0% in those communities. Segregation between the races was instilled into law, so much so that by 1912, the federal government under Woodrow Wilson was itself largely segregated to avoid, friction. It wasn't until Brown v. the Board of Education in 1954 did the Supreme Court overturn separate but equal doctrine that they defended in 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson. And it wasn't until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 where Jim Crow laws were overturned at the federal level. See, it's such a stark setback, and it took so long to even approach a solution. That was only 56 years ago from today, right? Let me put that into perspective, especially when you think about the length of time our government officials sit. Strom Thurmond, he was a staunch opponent of the Civil Rights Act, and he was a pro-segregationist. He was a senator from South Carolina between 1954 and 2003. Think about when the Civil Rights Act was put into place. He was in office. He was fighting against it, and he was still in office in 2003. And Lindsey Graham, of course, succeeded him. As of this recording, Lindsey is still in office. Carl Vinson, someone you may not have heard about, a Georgia senator from 1914 to 1965, also opposed to segregation. All right? These are long terms. People sit in these offices, and the Senate is a very powerful position. They hold office for a long time, and they hold these views for even longer. This is the point here. Laws may change, but public offices can be held for decades, and laws can be undermined in various ways. The Civil Rights Act overturned Jim Crow laws, but this led to suppression of a different sort, namely through laws targeting crime and expanding police authority. During the 80s, under Reagan, the U.S. began a domestic crackdown on crime, championing around a call for law and order. Anti-drug laws were put in place and affected economically disadvantaged groups most of all. And just some info here, individuals can be taken into custody and held without charge for up to 48 hours. Appearing before a court without a hired attorney gets you a public defender, often underpaid and underworked. This is not like TV. It's not like Law and Order when you go see trials and whatnot. That is not what the system is like. Police target groups of people. They bring them in. They don't even have to charge them. They can break them from their home. They can break up their day, right? And they can put them into a court system that is not designed to help them get out of trouble, but instead designed to find them. If you don't want to hang out in custody, you could post bail. Bail is incredibly expensive. There are also fines and fees associated with courts. Well, you can have payment plans. There are horror stories, people who spend 15 years trying to pay off court fees for things they didn't do. I myself was arrested when I was younger because somebody thought I pulled a gun on them. I did not. I didn't have a gun. They also thought I was driving around in a Jeep. I did not. I didn't have a driver's license. I was like 15. Lived in a trailer park and was poor, and we were often afraid of the police because they knew we couldn't defend ourselves financially. I was drawn in, paid $1,000 in bail, which nearly bankrupted my grandparents. I never got that $1,000 back. Nobody did. We never saw it again. And I can say this much too. The woman who accused me of this activity, she had to pay $100 to make the accusation. So think about that transition, that process. Somebody did this to this woman, pulled a gun on her. She went to the police. She paid $100 to get this person arrested. The police went around. They found somebody who fit the description. It was me. They called my grandparents, who then spent the next 48 hours looking for bail money to the tune of $1,000. And they set a court date like a month later at a public defender who then have all the charges dropped and everything. And when we left, I was super excited because I wasn't about to go to jail. But nevertheless, $1,000 poorer. And that was a good outcome. And let's not forget, though, being indicted on a felony makes you no longer, in most states, for a certain amount of time to vote. Which brings us sharply back to Jim Crow laws. Remember, I mean, there were a lot of effects, a lot of manifestations, but disenfranchisement was one of the major ones. Let's think about this. The national average differential between black and white inmates in the U.S. is 5-1. 5-1. Despite the fact that black individuals make up 13, roughly speaking, % of the population. Such a large portion of the population, of the black population, it makes it such a small portion of the U.S. population. And they've been disenfranchised through police targeting that sustains itself for economic and political reasons, right? There is a bail system, or you can pay to charge people. You have to pay to get out of jail. You have to pay for things in jail. And this isn't even bringing up prison. Jail is when they hold you for up to a year, or a place where they might hold you for up to a year, or prisons, longer term. There are fines associated with parole or probation, and many opportunities to put you right back into the system if you've ever been incarcerated. There's a policing system that is targeting marginalized individuals under the guise of law and order, motivated by greed, feeding into a privatized prison system, sustained by a constant input of people who cannot defend themselves, who do not have the resources to defend themselves, who cannot hire attorneys, who will ultimately, because they have no other options, just do what they can to pay the fines instead of fight against the injustice that they're experiencing. These are all features of Alexander's book, worth discussing. We've only pulled in one theme here, just that shift from the old Jim Crow, disenfranchising, up to the present day disenfranchising. Think about those numbers, 5-1. It's 13% of the population.